There are cities where time stands still, not because history forgot them, but because memory lives in every brick, every oak tree, every porch swing left creaking in the breeze. Savannah, Georgia, in the spring of 1975, was such a place. The azaleas had begun to bloom along the cobblestone squares, their pink and violet blossoms bursting through the silence like laughter after grief. The Spanish moss hung from the trees like old stories, and if you listened closely, you could hear the past breathing. Mary Harper walked the same path every morning, down Bull Street, past the cathedral, through Lafayette Square, until she reached her usual bench under a canopy of live oaks. She wasn't a woman who drew attention. Her hair had long since turned silver, her posture more cautious than graceful. But when she sang, something changed. She wasn't performing. There was no guitar case at her feet, no sign asking for coins. Her voice floated on the air like the scent of magnolias, gentle, nostalgic, full of something that couldn't be bought or sold. A southern folk song, soft and steady, hummed out from deep in her chest. It wasn't from her childhood, nor something passed down through generations. She'd learned it from a man, a soldier, Michael. It was the spring of 1945. He was a young Canadian infantryman stationed briefly in Savannah, assisting with post-war logistics. They met when the world was exhausted but still breathing. In between rubble and repair, in a moment neither of them expected, he played her that song one night in a makeshift cafe, his voice rough with dust and distance, and said, "Sing it when I'm gone, so I'm never really gone." She had sung it ever since. For 30 years, Mary returned to that same spot. She sang quietly, not for the people passing by, but for a memory that refused to fade. Michael had disappeared without a word, wounded, transferred, lost. She searched. Letters, consulates, silence, but the song remained. Then, on a morning like any other, she heard it. The same melody, the same rhythm, but from somewhere else, from someone else. Across the street, between the rhythm of footsteps and the rustle of newspapers, a voice answered hers, male, weathered, hesitant, with a slight northern drawl, familiar enough to stop her breath mid-note. Mary froze, her hands trembled in her lap. For a moment, the world disappeared. No traffic, no birds, no sky. Just that voice, the one she'd chased through dreams and memories for 3 decades. She turned, slowly, like opening a letter you've carried in your pocket for years, and there he was, older, thinner, shoulders slightly hunched beneath a worn denim jacket. But those eyes, those same pale blue eyes, eyes that once told her without saying a word that she was seen, that she was safe, that something beautiful could survive even in the wreckage. He was singing her song, their song. If this story moved you the way it moved me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. Mary didn't run. Her legs no longer moved like they once did, but something inside her, older than her bones, older than her voice, pulled her forward. Her shoes clicked against the stone path of the square like a steady drumbeat, one foot after another. The street between them stretched out longer than it should have, as if time had folded into the pavement, daring her to cross it. And she did, not like someone chasing a ghost, but like someone returning home. The small park across from Lafayette Square had changed. The benches had been repainted, the trees taller, the flowers new, but the feeling, that thick, humming stillness beneath the leaves, was the same. And there he was, sitting under a tulip tree, guitar across his knees, eyes half closed like someone drifting between memory and music. He was older. His once dark hair had thinned into soft grey wisps. His face was lined, not just with age, but with things unsaid. Yet she knew him, knew the shape of his shoulders, knew the way his fingers moved over the strings, knew more than anything the sound of his voice when it wrapped around that song. He hadn't noticed her yet. She stood in silence, watching, not sure if it was real, if he was real. Then his eyes opened, slowly, as if the years peeled back in that single blink. He saw her, and the music stopped. "Mary!" His voice cracked on the second syllable, not from disbelief but from something heavier. Recognition, grief, hope. She nodded. Her lips couldn't find words. Her heart was a drum, her throat a cage. I didn't know if you were still," he began, but the sentence hung in the air, unfinished, unsure of what tense to choose, past or present, life or memory. Mary sat beside him on the bench. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was sacred, like a hymn whispered between two pews. He turned toward her, looked at her the way a man looks at a country he left behind, slowly, with reverence. "I never forgot the song," she whispered. He smiled barely. "I didn't forget either," he said. "At least, not all of it." She looked at him. Really looked. There was something behind his eyes. Not just age, but absence. Something missing. "I was hurt," he said, as if he'd heard her thought. "After I left, it was in the last few weeks of the war. Shrapnel, head wound. They got me out, back to Halifax. I didn't know who I was for months." Mary stared straight ahead. Her fingers clutched the edge of the bench. "They said it would come back in pieces," he continued, "and it did. Slowly. My mother's voice, my name, a train ride. Then, nothing." He paused. "Except for the song, that damn song, it stayed." Mary's eyes welled. She turned to face him. "It brought you back." He nodded. "Not all the way, not enough to find you. I remembered your face, sometimes in dreams, never clearly, but when I'd play that tune, I'd feel you sitting beside me, just like now." They sat in silence again. The breeze moved through the branches, shaking loose a few petals that fell gently at their feet. "I looked for you," she said. "After the war, letters, Red Cross, the embassy. But then, nothing." Michael's voice was low. "I didn't even know I'd left something behind. I didn't know who I'd left behind until I heard that song again a few months ago, in a diner of all places. Some kid strumming it on a banjo." He chuckled softly, "and it just hit me like thunder in the chest. I remembered your voice, your eyes, you singing it back to me." Mary closed her eyes. For a moment, she could see herself again. 20 years old, dancing barefoot in the dust behind a church, laughing at something he'd said, her heart wide open and foolish. "I'd never stopped singing it," she said. "I know," he replied. "I heard you." They stayed there until the light began to fade, until the laughter of children in the distance gave way to the low hush of early evening. He reached for her hand. She let him. The song, after all, was never just a song. It was a compass, a promise, a bridge between what was and what still might be. In the spring of 1945, Savannah moved like an old man waking from a long sleep, slowly, carefully, with bones still aching from years of tension and silence. The war in Europe was finally reaching its end, though the official announcements were still days away. Word had already passed through the harbor, through the Navy Yard, through the trains and telegrams and whispers in the market. It was over, or nearly over, and while some neighborhoods celebrated with whiskey and parades, many corners of the city remained quiet, not from indifference, but because those who had lost most often didn't shout about it. Mary Harper was 20 then, her body still light with youth, but her eyes already carrying the weight of someone who had learned how quickly everything could disappear. She had once studied dance at the Savannah Civic Theater, long afternoons, in worn slippers and soft tights, spinning beneath cracked plaster ceilings while music drifted from dusty gramophones. But the war had ended all that, taking away the lights, the performances, the audiences, and finally the funding itself. What remained was the memory of movement, held tight in her posture, in the way her hands still curved without thought, in the quiet defiance of someone who refused to let go of beauty, even when the world seemed determined to bury it. She found refuge in a half-collapsed church on the east side of the city, where vines curled through the stonework and light spilled through what once had been stained glass. It had been hit during a coastal storm, not by bomb or fire, but by neglect and time. The altar was gone, the pews rotted or missing, but the air was still reverent. There was something about ruined spaces that made her feel more whole. She went there often, sat on the ledge of what used to be the choir loft, her legs crossed like a child's, her fingers tracing invisible piano keys on her lap as she listened to the wind push through broken beams. That's where she met him. Michael didn't announce himself. He walked in slow, careful steps, the steps of someone used to moving through unfamiliar terrain. He was in uniform, though less stiff than most soldiers she'd seen. His jacket was open at the collar, sleeves rolled up. His boots were scuffed, not from parade drills, but from long days on foot. Over his shoulder hung a guitar, worn, travel-stained, loved. When he spotted her, he didn't flinch or offer explanation. He simply nodded, gestured to a fallen beam nearby and said, "Mind if I sit?" She didn't answer immediately. He waited. Then she nodded once. They sat in silence for a few moments, two strangers in a building that remembered too much. He reached for the guitar and began to strum, not in performance, not for her, but for himself, the way someone hums to settle the nerves, to remind themselves that the world is still turning. The melody was soft, simple, unfamiliar to her ears, but unmistakably Southern. Something passed down rather than written, with roots deeper than sheet music. "My grandmother sang this," he said after a minute, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Back home in Missouri, then again up in Saskatchewan, where we moved after the crash. I play it when I don't know where else to begin." She didn't ask questions. Instead, her voice joined his tune. Not lyrics, not even a hum at first, but a soft echo of what he played, as if her breath had remembered a song she'd never learned. He stopped playing. She kept singing. Then they both laughed. It was the kind of laugh you only hear after silence, one that cracks something open and lets the light in. Over the following weeks, they returned to the ruined church at different times, never planned, never spoken. Sometimes he arrived first, sometimes she. Sometimes he brought coffee in a tin thermos, the kind shared by mechanics and sailors. One day he brought 2 slices of apple pie wrapped in wax paper and said, "It's not from a diner, it's from a widow near the harbor who said if I fixed her porch light, I deserved something sweet." They sat on the stone steps and ate in silence, letting the sugar coat their tongues and the wind cool their fingers. That day she asked him what would happen when the orders came. "They always come," he said, not with bitterness but with resignation. "When they do, I'll go, but until then..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the broken cross atop the roof, he handed her a small notebook. Leather cover, corners worn, pages filled with half-remembered lyrics, sketched chords, and strange verses that looked like they'd been scribbled on trains, in trenches, in hospital beds. On one page he had written, "If I forget, sing it. If I disappear, keep singing." He taught her the whole melody that night, every note, every turn of phrase, every quiet breath between verses. She memorized it not like a song, but like a promise. They didn't kiss. There was no dramatic goodbye, just hands touching for a moment longer than necessary, eyes that didn't want to forget. The next day, he was gone. No letter, no forwarding address. Only the song remained. And so she sang, through years, through grief, through silence, until the day she heard him sing it back. The days after their reunion moved differently, not quicker, not slower, but heavier, as if time had gained weight and every hour now carried with it the residue of all the ones that had been lost. Savannah in late spring had a way of holding on to the heat, and as the sun climbed higher over the city's rooftops, Mary and Michael found themselves walking through shaded streets, their footsteps echoing against stone and memory. They didn't speak of the past immediately. Not because there wasn't anything to say, but because some truths ask to be approached slowly, like a door that's been shut for years and creaks open only with care. It was on the fifth day, sitting on an iron bench in Forsyth Park, beneath a canopy of moss-draped oaks, that Mary finally asked, not with accusation, not even with pain, but simply with the weight of 30 years resting in her voice. "Why now, Michael? Why come back after all this time?" He didn't answer at first. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the breeze carry a newspaper down the path like a leaf that had lost its season. Then he exhaled, long and low, as if trying to clear a space inside himself where words could live again. "I didn't mean to disappear," he said. "That day, the day I left, I wasn't supposed to be transferred. I was helping load supplies, just a routine thing. When an officer came running saying there was a medical unit short on men, they needed help immediately. No goodbyes, just orders. And I followed." He paused, as if still following. Somewhere outside of Charleston, our convoy hit an old minefield, one that hadn't been cleared. I was in the second truck. Explosion knocked me out cold. When I woke up, I didn't know where I was, or who I was. Mary turned her face slightly, her fingers locked in her lap. She didn't interrupt. They called it memory loss due to trauma. War injury, they said. I remembered my name, eventually. I remembered my unit, my parents, the farm up north, but not you, not Savannah, not the church, not the song, not for a long time. He looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes, not guilt, not shame, but the hollow ache of someone who had lived for years next to a room he never entered. "But the song," he continued, "it came back to me first, before the rest. I'd find myself humming it in hospital beds, during long walks, even in my sleep. I didn't know why, just that it felt safe, like something I'd promised." She nodded slowly. "And did it bring you here?" she asked. "Not right away," he said. "I tried to find you once my memory started returning, but your last name had changed, and the church was gone. I wrote letters. I checked with the Veterans Department. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself maybe you had moved on, married, forgotten." He looked down at his hands, now older and spotted, but still carrying the memory of chords. But the guilt never left, and neither did the song. Every time I played it, your voice would come back, not clearly, but enough. Enough to remind me there was something unfinished. Mary sat quietly. The leaves above them stirred. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played, soft and slow. "And then," he said, "2 months ago, I got an invitation from the city of Savannah. They were planning a commemoration for veterans and civilian reconstruction workers who had served during or just after the war. My name came up in some record. I guess they tracked me through the Canadian archives. I almost threw it out." He laughed, not with humor, but disbelief. "But then I saw the date, spring, late April, and something told me it was time." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. Frayed edges, stained corners. He held it out to her. "I kept this all these years. I don't remember writing all of it. But your name is in here, written over and over, along with the lyrics, and a line you once said, 'Sing it so you won't forget.'" Mary took the notebook with trembling hands, flipped through the pages. Her own handwriting appeared on one, just a single word, "Home." "I stayed here, you know," she said softly. "I waited. At first, every day, then just on Sundays, then every spring." He looked at her then the way someone looks at a horizon, something both distant and full of light. "I want to stay this time," he said. "I know I'm older now. I know time doesn't owe me much, but I'd like to teach, maybe down at the music center. Teach the song to kids, so it lives on, so it doesn't end with us." Mary didn't speak. Instead, she reached for his hand and he let her hold it. And for a long moment, they simply sat there, the past no longer behind them, but beside them, quiet, forgiving, and humming softly between their palms. The city of Savannah had always known how to celebrate. From jazz parades in the spring to candlelit vigils on the riverfront, it had a rhythm of its own, slow, thoughtful, steeped in tradition. But on that particular April afternoon in 1975, as the sun warmed the iron balconies and magnolia blossoms dusted the streets, the mood was different. Not somber exactly, not joyous either. Something in between. A kind of reverence that only comes when a community gathers not to forget the past, but to finally speak it aloud. A temporary stage had been set up in the center of Chippewa Square. Folding chairs filled quickly, many occupied by people who remembered when the roads were still cracked with shell damage, when rations were handed out in paper sacks, when the future had felt fragile. The ceremony was to honor those who had stayed and those who had come back, the builders, the nurses, the wives, the soldiers. Veterans were introduced by name, each called to stand, their stories read in brief, clipped tones by the city historian. Then, almost as an afterthought, a final name was announced. Softly, but with weight, Miss Mary Harper will now sing a song of remembrance. There was no fanfare, no lights, no grand introduction, just her. Mary stepped forward, wearing a navy blue dress, simple and elegant, the kind women of her generation wore for church or funerals, or the kind of occasions where silence meant more than applause. Her hair was pinned back, her shoulders squared, but as she approached the microphone, something in her eyes flickered, a blend of nervousness and peace. The feeling of having waited 3 decades to exhale. She did not speak. She simply closed her eyes and began to sing. The melody floated gently over the crowd, warm and familiar to those who had heard it in their youth, unfamiliar and hauntingly beautiful to the younger faces listening for the first time. It was not a patriotic anthem, not a hymn, not a love song, but it carried all three. Each note felt lived in, each word worn smooth by years of memory. Her voice, though aged, had not weakened. If anything, time had made it deeper, richer with loss, gentler with grace. And then, just as she reached the second verse, the music changed. A guitar strummed gently, confidently from the edge of the stage. A figure stepped forward. Michael. Wearing a pressed white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a guitar strap across his shoulder, and a look on his face that could only be described as gratitude wrapped in disbelief. For a heartbeat, the crowd did not react. They simply watched, as if unsure whether this moment belonged to them or to the two souls at its center. Mary didn't stop singing, but her eyes opened. And when she saw him, standing there, she smiled, not with surprise, not with shock, but with recognition, as if this had always been the plan, somehow written in the margins of both their lives. Michael joined in. Not overpowering, not dramatic, just his voice beside hers, filling the gaps where memory had once lived alone. They sang like that, two voices finding harmony again after decades of silence. He played gently, letting her lead as he always had. She sang with the steadiness of someone who had kept a promise, and together they filled the square with something that was not just sound, but history, hope, healing. When the final note hung in the air, there was a long pause, the kind that stretches time. Then slowly the crowd rose to their feet, not with cheers, not with shouts, but with quiet, sustained applause. Tears on cheeks, hats removed, children tugging at sleeves, asking who they were, what the song meant, and in the faces of the old men and women in the front row, there was a look not of envy, but of understanding. Mary and Michael did not bow. They simply stepped back, hand in hand, as if they had finally walked through a door that had been waiting to open since 1945. Behind the stage, where the crowd could not see, Michael set down his guitar and turned to her. "I wasn't sure I could do it," he said. "You didn't have to," she replied. "You just had to show up." He laughed. Not loudly, but freely. Later, people would say it was the most moving moment of the ceremony, that they had never seen two people stand so still and yet say so much. that the song itself felt like a letter mailed across time, finally delivered. But Mary and Michael didn't need to hear any of it, because they knew some songs aren't written to be remembered, they're written to bring us home. Summer arrived in Savannah like an old friend who never needed to knock. Slow, warm, familiar, with sunlight draping itself over front porches and laughter trickling through open windows. The trees along the squares stood heavier with leaves, the air thick with magnolia and river breeze. And time, at last, seemed to have slowed enough for two hearts to catch up with all they had missed. Michael didn't leave. What had begun as a return, temporary, cautious, unsure, became a homecoming. He rented a modest upstairs apartment in a weathered Victorian near Pulaski Square, the kind with creaky floorboards and a balcony just wide enough for a rocking chair. He spent his mornings with a cup of black coffee, watching the city stretch itself awake. And every afternoon, without fail, he walked to the community center on Liberty Street with his guitar slung across his back and a satchel full of music sheets tucked under his arm. He taught children how to play, not just the notes, though there were plenty, but the stories behind them. He told them where each melody came from, what it once meant, who it had traveled with across oceans and decades. His classroom was never quiet, never strict. He let the kids sing loud, wrong, joyful. He taught them that sometimes a song doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be honest. And always, near the end of every lesson, he would play that song, the one from long ago. Sometimes he sang it alone. Sometimes Mary would stop by and join him, her voice softer now, but still carrying that unshakable steadiness, like an old oak that had seen every season and still stood tall. She came often. She didn't say much during the lessons. She would sit in the corner with a notebook or a cup of tea, watching the children fumble and flourish, the way young people do when no one's telling them they can't. And every once in a while, when the light hit just right or a certain harmony made its way through the air, she would smile. Not the kind of smile that flashes, but the kind that settles in, deep and real. Mary had found her joy again. Not in performance, not in stages or applause, but in presence, in the quiet miracle of having someone back, not as they were, but as they had become. A little slower, a little more scarred, but still there. Michael never asked for attention. He didn't tell many people his story, but word got around about the man with the guitar who used to be gone, about the woman who waited 30 years, about the song that bridged the silence. And so by fall, the community center started calling the youth choir the Songkeepers. They sang at local festivals, at schools, in churches. They sang old folk songs and new ones, and always they ended with that melody. It no longer belonged to just Mary and Michael. It belonged to every child who learned it, every parent who heard it, every passerby who stopped at the sound of something that felt older than words. One afternoon, sitting beneath the same tree where they had first spoken in the park, Mary looked over at Michael and asked, "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" He laughed, his fingers picking absently at the guitar. "I didn't think I'd end up anywhere," he said, "but I'm glad it's here." They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing more, because sometimes the story doesn't need another chapter, just a chorus that keeps being sung. We have new videos every day, true stories that inspire and stay with you.